A single second can feel like an infinity when it carries the weight of a life-changing choice and a deep, raw emotion. We capture those eternal moments and turn them into cinematic art for your pleasure. Subscribe today and explore the infinite nature of the human story.
3 days before Thanksgiving, my son called and used 9 words that unraveled everything I thought I understood about being a father. "Dad, don't drive up. Jennifer says it's not a good time." I was standing in my garage in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, halfway through loading a cooler with the sweet potato casserole I had been making from scratch for 2 days, his grandmother's recipe, the one he had asked me to bring every year since he was 7 years old. I set the phone down on the workbench and stood very still for a long moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower. And I tried to make sense of what I had just heard. Not a good time. As if I were a dentist appointment he was rescheduling. I was 64 years old. I had raised that boy alone for 11 years after his mother passed. I had coached his Little League teams and driven him to SAT prep and co-signed his first car loan and stood in the front row at his wedding 4 years ago with tears I was not embarrassed about. And now his wife had decided that Thanksgiving, the holiday his mother had loved more than any other, was not a good time for me. So I unpacked the cooler. I put the casserole in the refrigerator. I drove to a diner on the edge of town called Rosie's that stayed open on holidays because the owner, a woman named Gloria, believed nobody should eat alone if she could help it. I sat at the counter with a plate of turkey that was perfectly fine and tasted like nothing at all. The man 2 stools down struck up a conversation about Louisiana State football. His name was Earl Hutchins, and his wife Patrice was sitting beside him, and by the time the pie came out, they had invited me to sit at their table. I almost said no. I was 64 years old, and I had spent a lifetime being self-sufficient, the way men of my generation were raised to be. You handled your pain privately. You did not burden strangers with your family problems on a holiday. But there was something about the way Earl asked, not with pity, just with the plain warmth of a man who had enough room at his table and saw no reason not to share it, that made me slide off that stool and carry my pie over to where they were sitting. I had no way of knowing that decision would reshape the next 5 years of my life. Earl Hutchins had been a high school football coach for 26 years, before a bad knee forced him to retire. Patrice had run a home daycare for 3 decades and had strong opinions about child rearing, pecan pie, and the importance of showing up when people needed you. They had 2 daughters, both grown, one in New Orleans and one in Memphis. The holidays used to mean the whole family crammed into their house on Sycamore Street, Patrice told me. Now it was quieter. They were still learning what quiet looked like. I told them about Daniel, about Jennifer, about the phone call 3 days earlier, and the sweet potato casserole sitting in my refrigerator at home. I had not planned to say any of it. But Earl had the kind of face that made honesty feel reasonable, and Patrice had already refilled my coffee without being asked, and somehow the words came out. "That's a hard thing," Earl said. He did not offer a solution or tell me what I should have done differently. He just said it plainly, the way you acknowledge a fact. And something about that simple recognition loosened something in my chest that had been wound tight since the phone call. When we finished eating, Patrice wrote their address on a paper napkin and told me they had people over most Sunday afternoons, neighbors, their daughters when they were in town, anyone who wanted a place to be. "You don't need an invitation," she said. "Just come." Earl shook my hand at the door and held it a beat longer than a handshake requires, the way older men do when they want to say something they don't have words for. I drove home through the warm Louisiana evening and thought about my son. Daniel was 31. He had met Jennifer at a work conference in Dallas 3 years before they married. And I had tried from the beginning to like her. She was sharp and organized and had strong ideas about how things should be done. The first Christmas after they got engaged, she rearranged my kitchen while she was visiting because she said the layout was inefficient. I laughed it off. Daniel laughed too, a little too quickly. That laugh would become familiar over the following years, the laugh he used to signal that whatever Jennifer had just said or done was fine, actually. And I should agree. The real trouble started at their wedding rehearsal dinner. Jennifer's father made a toast that went on for 12 minutes and mentioned me once, in passing, as Daniel's dad from down south. I did not say anything. What was there to say? I made my own toast, kept it to 3 minutes, talked about how much his mother would have loved this day. Afterward, Jennifer pulled Daniel aside, and I watched them from across the room, and I watched my son nod repeatedly, in a way that looked less like agreement and more like submission. On the drive back to the hotel, he told me that Jennifer felt my toast had made the evening too heavy. Her exact words, he said, were that I needed to learn to read a room. I said nothing. I filed it away. Over the next 2 years, the filing cabinet filled up. I was not invited to their housewarming, because Jennifer said they wanted to keep it to close friends. I was told not to stop by without calling ahead reasonable enough on its own, but the calls were never answered and the voicemails were rarely returned. When my grandson Tyler was born, I drove 9 hours from Baton Rouge to Nashville with a truckload of things I had spent 3 weeks collecting: a rocking chair I refinished myself, books his mother used to read to Daniel, a hand-stitched quilt a woman at my church made as a gift. Jennifer thanked me in the flat tone of someone completing a task and told me the nursery theme was already set. The rocking chair ended up in the garage. I do not know what happened to the quilt. I told myself it was just an adjustment period. New marriages were complicated. Jennifer came from a family that operated differently than mine. I would be patient. I would try harder. I would learn to read the room, but that Thanksgiving phone call changed something. Not a good time. 9 words that told me exactly where I stood. I showed up at Patrice and Earl's house the following Sunday. Patrice answered the door with flour on her hands and waved me inside, like I had been coming for years. Their back porch was full of neighbors: a retired postal worker named Jean, a young couple from 2 doors down who had just moved from Chicago, Earl's former assistant coach and his wife. I helped Earl move some chairs around and ended up staying 4 hours. Nobody asked about my family. Nobody offered advice. We talked about football and weather and a new barbecue place that had opened on Route 61, and when I left, I felt, for the first time in months, like a person rather than a problem. I kept going back. Sunday afternoons became the fixed point of my week. I started bringing food: the sweet potato casserole, a crawfish étouffée that Earl declared the best thing he had ever eaten, a peach cobbler from my mother's recipe that made Patrice tear up a little the first time she tasted it. Earl's grandchildren visited on alternating weekends, and I taught the oldest one, a 10-year-old named Marcus, to play checkers. I helped Jean build a raised garden bed. I fixed a leak under Patrice's kitchen sink that had apparently been dripping for 2 years. I did not hear from Daniel in any meaningful way during those months. He texted occasionally short messages, often responses to things I had sent first. He called on my birthday, a 4-minute conversation in which he sounded distracted and asked no questions. When I sent gifts for Tyler's first birthday, I received a group text that Jennifer had clearly written thanking everyone who had contributed to Tyler's big day. I was on a list. The silence hurt the way a slow leak hurts, not dramatic, not sudden. Just a steady draining of something you didn't realize was finite. Then, about 16 months after that first Thanksgiving alone, I was sitting on Earl and Patrice's porch when Patrice came outside with red eyes and sat down in the chair beside me without saying anything for a long moment. Earl put his hand on her knee. I waited. Her brother Thomas had called that morning, she finally said. Their father had passed. The 2 of them had not spoken in 8 years, a falling out over money after their mother's estate was settled. Patrice had written letters that went unanswered. She had tried calling on holidays. Nothing, and now there was no more time. He was just gone, she said. And every stupid thing we fought about is still there, but he isn't. I sat with that for a long time after I drove home. I thought about Daniel asleep in a house 9 hours away with my grandson I barely knew. I thought about what it would mean to let 8 years pass and then get a phone call like the one Patrice had gotten. I thought about his mother and what she would say to me if she were here. I drove to the store that week and bought a card. I wrote 3 sentences. I said I missed him. I said I hoped Tyler was doing well. I said I was there whenever he was ready. I mailed it to the Nashville address and heard nothing back. I sent a card on Daniel's birthday 3 months later. Nothing. I called once on Father's Day and left a voicemail. He did not call back. The rejection still had the power to knock the wind out of me, but I noticed that it was not destroying me the way it might have 2 years earlier. Something had changed. I had somewhere to be on Sunday afternoons. I had people who saved me a seat. I had a life that was full in ways I had not expected. And while the empty space, where my son should have been, never stopped hurting, it existed alongside something real and solid and good. 2.5 years after that Thanksgiving phone call, on a Wednesday morning in February, Daniel called me. I was at the hardware store when my phone rang. I saw his name on the screen and stood very still for a moment in the middle of the aisle before I answered. Dad. His voice was different, thinner, like something had been pressing on it. I'm here, I said. There was a pause long enough that I started to feel something rise in my chest, some old, stubborn hope that this was the call I had been waiting for. An apology, an acknowledgement, some version of I know I've been absent and I'm sorry and I want to do better. Then he said, Jennifer and I have been having some problems. Financial stuff. I took on a business partner last year and it went bad. And there are some debts that need to be settled before they become a legal issue. I know your retirement account has done well. I've looked into it. And you could liquidate enough too. I put my hand on a shelf to steady myself. Daniel, I said carefully, when did we last have a real conversation? Silence. Not a text, I said. Not a birthday call. A real conversation, where you asked me something about my life, and I asked you something about yours. Dad, he said. It's been a complicated year. It has been 2.5 years, I said. 2.5 years of distance that your wife built and you allowed. You didn't call me when Tyler started walking. You didn't call me when you changed jobs. I found out about the business from a mutual friend 7 months ago, and now you're calling because you need money. That's not fair. His voice sharpened. You know how Jennifer is. She has a hard time with me, I finished. I know. I have always been the problem, Daniel. Too old-fashioned, too southern, too much of something she didn't want in her house. I understand that. What I don't understand is how you let 2 years become 3 without picking up the phone yourself. I'm picking it up now, because you need something from me. The line was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing. I love you, I said. I have never stopped loving you for a single day of your life. But I can't give you money to solve a problem that will come back next year with a different name. And I can't let you call me an ATM and pretend that's a relationship. I have a life now, Daniel. I have people who show up for me on Sunday afternoons, not because they need anything, but because they want to be there. I choose that. I choose to be valued, not just useful. The silence stretched out. Then his voice went cold, in a way I had never heard from him before. A coldness I recognized from somewhere else. From another voice. Jennifer was right about you, he said. She always said you made everything about yourself. She said you were never going to respect our boundaries, and I spent 4 years defending you. I'm done defending you, Dad. Don't call me. The call ended. I stood in the hardware store aisle for what might have been 5 minutes. A teenage employee walked by and asked if I needed help finding something. I said no thank you. I put my phone in my pocket and walked to my truck and sat there with my hands on the steering wheel. The grief was real. I will not pretend it wasn't. This was my son, the child I had raised alone, the person I had stayed up with through fevers and nightmares and the kind of adolescent pain that doesn't have a name. The grief was deep and specific, and it sat in my chest like a stone. But underneath it, again, was that unexpected thing. Relief. I had told the truth. I had finally said out loud what had been true for years. And now at least we both knew where we stood. I was not going to keep shrinking myself to fit into whatever space Jennifer decided I was allowed to occupy. I was done with that. That evening I drove to Patrice and Earl's house without calling ahead. Earl opened the door, took one look at my face, and said, "Come on in. Patrice is making gumbo." I sat at their kitchen table and told them everything. They listened the way they always did, without interrupting, without rushing to fix anything. When I finished, Patrice put a bowl in front of me and sat down across from me. "You did the right thing," she said. "Saying the truth out loud is always the right thing, even when it costs you." "It costs a lot," I said. Earl set down his spoon and looked at me directly. "You didn't lose your son today," he said. "You lost him piece by piece over 4 years. Today, you just stopped pretending you hadn't." He was right. I had known it for a long time. Every time I laughed off Jennifer rearranging my kitchen, every time I accepted being left off an invitation or left out of a milestone, every time I told myself that if I were patient enough, accommodating enough, invisible enough, things would eventually get better. I had been slowly disappearing, and my son had let it happen. And somewhere along the way, he had started to believe the story Jennifer told about me. "What do you do now?" Patrice asked. "You keep living," Earl said before I could answer. "You keep showing up on Sundays. You let us love you." He shook his head like the rest of it was obvious. "That's the whole job." 3 years passed without a word from Daniel. 3 years of Sundays at Patrice and Earl's. 3 years of watching Marcus grow from a 10-year-old who couldn't sit still at a checkerboard to a 13-year-old who beat me regularly and knew it. 3 years of Jean's garden producing more tomatoes than any one man could use, and of the young couple from Chicago, Tom and Alicia, having their first baby and asking me to be the one to drive them to the hospital because their families were too far away. I sat in the waiting room for 6 hours that night, and when Tom came out with tears on his face and told me it was a girl, I hugged him the way I would have hugged Daniel. I retired from my job at the civil engineering firm and started teaching a drafting class at the community college on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. My students were mostly young, mostly working 2 jobs, mostly trying to build something from limited resources. I liked them enormously. I liked being useful in a way that had nothing to do with my bank account. I thought about Tyler. He was 4 years old, and I had not seen him since his first birthday. I did not know what he looked like now, what he was interested in, whether he had his mother's eyes or his grandmother's stubbornness. That absence was the sharpest pain of all. Then, on a Thursday evening in October, my phone rang with a Nashville number I did not recognize. "This is Dr. Anand at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. I'm trying to reach the father of Daniel Warren." The drive from Baton Rouge to Nashville took 8.5 hours. I drove all of it in the dark, stopping once for gas, calling Earl from the road. He said he and Patrice would drive up the next morning. I said that wasn't necessary. He said, "Robert James Warren, don't tell me what's necessary." Daniel had collapsed at work, a cardiac event. Not a heart attack in the classic sense, but an arrhythmia that had apparently been undetected for years, complicated by stress and a blood pressure that had been dangerously high. He was stable, the doctor told me when I arrived, but it had been close, and there would be a procedure in the morning. Jennifer was in the hallway outside his room when I got there. We had not been in the same space in 4 years. She looked at me the way you look at something unexpected, not hostile, just startled, recalibrating. She said Daniel had listed me as his emergency contact. She said it like she didn't entirely understand why. Tyler was in the waiting room with a woman I did not recognize, a neighbor Jennifer had called. He was 4 years old and he looked exactly like Daniel at that age. And he looked at me with the careful assessment of a child who has been told things about a person and is now trying to match what he sees to what he was told. I sat down next to him, leaving space between us. "Hi," I said. "My name is Grandpa Jim. Your dad talks about you all the time when I used to see him." This was not entirely true, but it was the kindest version of the truth available to a 4-year-old whose father was down the hall. He thought about this. "Do you like trucks?" he asked. "I love trucks," I said. "What kind do you have?" We talked about trucks for 45 minutes. By the time Earl and Patrice arrived the next morning, Tyler had shown me every photograph in Jennifer's phone that featured any vehicle, and had accepted half of my granola bar. Earl and Patrice brought food, which Patrice simply began distributing to everyone in the waiting room as if she had been in charge all along. Jennifer watched this with an expression I could not quite read. The procedure went smoothly. Daniel was awake by the afternoon. I went in alone first, because Jennifer asked me to, and because I understood that however complicated the next conversation would be, he needed to see his father without an audience. He was pale and smaller looking than I remembered, the way people look when something serious has happened to their bodies. He looked at me when I walked in, and his face did something complicated. I sat down in the chair beside his bed. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I did," I said. "That's just a fact." He was quiet for a long time. The monitors beeped steadily. Through the window I could see the Nashville skyline in the pale October light. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said finally. "In the ambulance, when I didn't know what was going to happen." He stopped. "I kept thinking about you, about the last thing I said to you. I know what you said. I was awful, Dad." He pressed his eyes closed. "I've been awful for a long time. And I told myself it was complicated, and that you didn't understand our dynamic, and that Jennifer had valid reasons." And he stopped again. "She had valid reasons for some things. I had valid reasons for some things. But cutting you out was not one of them. What I let happen to you was not okay. What I said on that phone call was unforgivable." "It's not unforgivable," I said. "You never got to know Tyler." I said nothing. "I thought about Mom," he said. "In the ambulance. I thought about how she would look at me right now." He opened his eyes and they were wet. "I don't think she'd recognize me, Dad. I don't think she'd like who I became. There are few things harder than watching your child grieve something they did to themselves. I have never been a man who cries easily, but I was close in that room." I reached over and put my hand on his arm. "She'd recognize you," I said. "She'd just want you back." Earl and Patrice stayed 3 days. By the second day, Patrice had somehow taken over Daniel and Jennifer's kitchen to cook proper meals for the household. And Tyler had decided that Earl was the funniest person he had ever met. I watched my grandson follow Earl around the apartment, pulling at his sleeve to get his attention, and I felt something in my chest that I had no good word for, something that was grief and gratitude, tangled together so completely they were indistinguishable. Jennifer and I did not have a dramatic conversation. It was quieter than that. She came to me on the second morning while everyone else was occupied and stood in the doorway of the small guest room where I was staying and said, "I know I owe you more than this, but I want to start with I'm sorry." I believe she meant it. I told her I accepted it. We left it at that, because that was all either of us was ready for, and forcing more would have broken it. The Sunday 6 weeks later, when Daniel brought Tyler to Patrice and Earl's house, was the most nervous I had been since I walked into a hospital room in Nashville at 2 in the morning. I stood in their driveway watching the car pull up and tried to keep my hands still. Tyler got out of the car first, at the speed children always approach anything new, which is to say immediately, and with complete commitment. He grabbed my hand without any preamble and said, "Is this where the man with the funny voice lives?" "That's Earl," I said. "I want to meet him," he said. That was how it started. The afternoon was imperfect and slightly awkward in the ways that first times always are. Daniel was quieter than usual, watching. Jennifer stayed near him at first, learning the geography of this world I had been living in without her knowledge. But Patrice pulled her into the kitchen within 20 minutes, because Patrice believed that kitchens were where people became real to each other, and she was right. And by the time dinner was on the table, Jennifer was laughing at something Patrice had said with a laugh I had not heard from her before. Unguarded, unperformed. On the drive home, Daniel called me from his car. Tyler had fallen asleep in the back seat, he said. "Thank you for not giving up," he said. "I wouldn't have blamed you. I gave you every reason to. I thought about Earl telling me I had not lost my son today. Just let myself see it. I thought about Patrice's brother, gone before there was time to fix anything. I thought about the sweet potato casserole sitting in my refrigerator on Thanksgiving 4 years ago, and the stranger who had asked me to move 2 stools down and join him and his wife. "I'm your father," I said. "That's the whole job." He laughed a real laugh, the laugh I remembered from when he was a boy. "Yeah," he said. "I know. I'm just starting to understand what that means." This past Thanksgiving, 4 years after that first night at Rosie's Diner, I sat at Earl and Patrice's table with a house full of people and felt something I could not have named back when I was standing in my garage with a cooler full of sweet potato casserole, trying to understand how I had become unnecessary to my own family. What I felt was wholeness. Not the fragile wholeness of someone who has been let back in on good behavior, but the solid wholeness of a man who knows exactly who he is and where he belongs and how he got here. Tyler sat beside me and ate 3 servings of the sweet potato casserole, his grandmother's recipe, which I had finally taught Daniel to make, and told me at length about a dinosaur documentary he had watched 3 times. Daniel caught my eye across the table and raised his glass. Jennifer was helping Patrice in the kitchen. Earl was losing an argument about football to Marcus, who was now 15 and insufferably confident, the way 15-year-olds should be. If you are watching this and you are sitting in the silence that someone else chose for you, if you are the parent who got edited out, the father who became inconvenient, the person who was told that showing up for the people you love made you too complicated, I want to tell you something. Build the life anyway. Find the Earl and Patrice. Show up on Sunday afternoons and bring food and fix the leaky sink and teach the kids to play checkers. Let yourself be loved by people who have no obligation to love you, because that is the purest kind. And it will teach you something about your own worth that the people who rejected you could not. Don't give the money. Don't disappear to make room. Don't let the filing cabinet keep filling while you wait for things to improve on their own. Say the true thing, even when it costs you. It will cost you. Pay it. And hold on, because the people who hurt you may still be capable of finding their way back. Not because you waited passively, not because you forgave immediately, but because you built a life that was worth coming back to, and sometimes the sight of that is exactly what it takes to crack someone open. The best thing I ever did was sit down at a diner counter on Thanksgiving and let a stranger invite me to his table. Everything else followed from that. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. And remember, you are not too much. You are not too complicated. You are not the problem. Sometimes you are simply too good for the space you were given, and the answer is to find a bigger table. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.